Okay, we're on to Japan. Now, Japan is a country whose relationship with its physical geography is exceptionally close, closely defining its sense of insecurity historically while propelling it to empire in the 20th century, as you'll see. Now, first off, as I usually do with um, a country or certainly a new region, let's look at some of the basic physical aspects of Japan, which I'm disproportionately going to ask you about, obviously. All right. Now, as you can see here, Japan is a heavily populated country, estimated in 2018-19. Well, yeah, if I don't know today, it's going to be about 126 million people or so. And you might consider that to be more or less about 40% the size of the U.S., the entire U.S. population, on a land area that is somewhat the same size as California. All right, so by the way, it has a large population, but its population growth rate is extremely low. In fact, it's diminishing, which is an issue perhaps I'll reference later. In any case, so you have this densely populated set of islands off the east coast of Asia. And the problem is, as you can see here, is that the topography, the character of the surface of the land, is extremely mountainous. In effect, there's only about roughly 15 to 20% of the land area of the country that is suitable for intensive rice cultivation. All right, so you've got very little good level land that's necessary to historically feed that population. Rice being the staple crop of this portion of the world. Now, one of the overriding concerns historically, therefore, in the Japanese psyche is the thought of feeding that huge population. So, as you can see in this image here, there was a small patch of land in the central eastern portion of the main island of Honshu here, this small patch of land here, where it's relatively level. And this patch of land is called the Kanto Plain, as I've labeled on there. All right, the Kanto Plain. And thus, Japan has historically been focused on this relatively level land. All right, so on this small patch of land, relatively speaking, you get extremely intensive agricultural production and extremely intensive industrial production, because industry likes to be on level land just as much as agriculture does. It's also a significant patch of land because it has a great port right here, that being Tokyo, this Tokyo Yokohama. In fact, here's a closer image of it. This is Tokyo Yokohama as seen from space. It's often referred to as the Tokyo Yokohama urban area since they have coalesced into one large urban area. And by the way, this is the world's largest urban area. All right, it's referred to the world. This is the world's largest urban area at about 31 million people. Some say there are some larger populations in the underdeveloped world, but it's difficult to get an accurate measure of those populations. It is recognized that Tokyo Yokohama is the official largest city. I don't want to say city because these cities have all grown together into urban areas. This is the world's largest urban area at about 31 million people. All right. Now, the irony is that you can see Tokyo located right over here. This is a map of Earth's tectonic plates, all right, these crustal plates. And you can make a strong case that it is the irony of irony that the world's largest urban area is located at essentially the convergence point for three tectonic plates. Arguably, this is the worst possible location for the world's largest urban area. Nevertheless, it makes you understand why the Japanese are the most earthquake prepared people on Earth by far and away. All right. This is the collapse of the Kobe Expressway in 1995 after a quake. And what aggravates the damage for Tokyo is that, like many bay cities, much of a bay city is actually built on landfill. All right, you can sort of, here's an example. This is Hong Kong. All right, you can see what Hong Kong looked like in the early 1970s. You can see its coastline over here. All right, what often happens with bay cities is material is dumped into the bay, compacted, we'll call it infill, and this becomes a possible growth zone for the city to expand onto. You can see that here in Tokyo, Yokohama. Does not these peripheral areas in here, the bay, look artificial, if you would? Well, that's exactly what's happened here. And the reason why this is problematic is, despite this landfill being compacted, it's subject to an effect called liquefaction, that when an earthquake hits, if it hits just the right resonance, all right, anything built on improperly compacted material, that material will act like a liquid, and anything built on top of it will sink right into it, all right? And so therefore you have such a large population, or a substantial portion of it, that's at or near landfill. You're looking at a problem during an earthquake. You can sort of get the idea here. Here's a collapsed fifth floor from the Kobe quake in '95. And not only is this a problem with respect to the collapse of buildings, but of course you get the real threat is not really the immediate damage by the quake, but often fires, because material falls from up on high, it congests and blocks roadways, therefore fire crews can't get to where you have fires, which they could ordinarily put out, but you can't if you have these type of blockages. There's your real threat in any case. So you can see how Tokyo, Yokohama is particularly subject to natural hazards. There's another natural hazard that you want to take note of here that affects Japan disproportionately, and that's a high incidence of tsunamis. If you want a definition for a tsunami is a seismic tidal wave. In other words, an earthquake happens out at sea, and it produces out at sea, which is a relatively mild wave, it appears, if you're out at sea. But as that wave slowly moves to the coast and climbs up onto the continental shelf, by the time it hits terra firma, you're going to get a substantial wave. And so therefore these areas here are subject to tsunamis, and you can see the incidence of tsunamis here recently. Now, you have to take into account that humans like to live near the sea disproportionately. That makes them more subject to seismic tidal waves, as is indicated by the population density here in this map. Now, back to a particular note was the earthquake that just occurred in 2011. You can see it occurred right off the northeastern section of Honshu, and produced a substantial tidal wave impacting the eastern portion of the island of Honshu. I believe the deaths were about 200,000, 220,000 or so, causing also the nuclear problem at the nuclear plant of Fukushima Daiichi. In any case, if I had time in class, I wouldn't mind talking about that. But here we'll just move along. You can see how Japan is subject to this natural hazard as well. In fact, here you can see the impact of tsunami damage. This was on the island of Sumatra. This is in Indonesia. And you can see what it looked like before a tsunami hit, and then shortly after. That's how far in the wave went. They can be incredibly damaging in any case. All right, that's so you have the tsunamis as a natural hazard. In fact, if you look on YouTube, you'll see numerous interesting videos of the tsunami coming ashore. Really quite impressive in any case. Another image. Now, another natural hazard that Japan is particularly subject to. All right, we've talked about tsunamis, we've talked about earthquakes. The other one is, of course, volcanoes, which is also a product of plate collision, just like tsunamis and earthquakes are. All right, so you can see that Japan has a high incidence of active volcanoes. The most famous of which, of course, is Mount Fuji here. known for its near perfect conical perfection. And you have to say that if you have all these tectonic plate related natural hazards, there's another one you can point out here, and that is you're going to get landslides. You can see here what this area looked like in 2004, just in August 13th. Shortly thereafter, you can see after a landslide occurred. And so, yeah, you have another natural hazard. Okay. Now, I believe I've already talked about plate tectonics in sub-Saharan Africa, but you have an image here actually showing what's occurring in Japan as one plate. Of course, there it's flipped over, of course, heading in, everything is flipped over, but you have a subduction plate here being subducted. Under this is the override plate, and the compaction going on here pushes up this mountain range here. That mountain range essentially is Japan in this particular instance. A lot of that magma semi-liquid crustal material here works its way up, causing an inflammation at the surface here, and that's essentially what a volcano is. We already know that. We talked about that in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, therefore, when you look at an image like this, where you can look at the ocean, you can actually see the trench, which is associated with plate tectonic collision here. We have this plate here clearly sliding right under that plate here, and you can see that Japan is sitting on the override plate. All right, so that's what when you see a long oceanic trench like that, you're looking at plate contact zone, usually a subduction zone. As you can see here, when we look at Japan located right over here, Japan is located on what's called the Ring of Fire. Here's a definition for the Ring of Fire: a zone of vigorous plate subduction along the inhabited rim of the Pacific Ocean. It's characterized by earthquakes, volcanoes, and tsunamis. In fact, if you look all along the perimeter, the inhabited perimeter, not the portion bordering Antarctica, but the inhabited perimeter of the Pacific Ocean, you find, by and large, substantial tectonic activity, usually subduction zones. Some of them are not perfect subduction zones. You have transform faults around California and over here. Let's not worry about those. All right. The Ring of Fire is just that. All right. A zone of vigorous plate subduction along the perimeter of the Pacific. And Japan is directly on it. There is another natural hazard you want to take note of in Japan, and it's not associated with plate tectonics like the other four that I pointed out are, and that is that Japan is on a tropical storm track. In other words, you expect to get a number of substantial tropical storms which generally travel up in this direction. You can see here's a tropical storm over here. All right, you can see there were two previous, there was another one over here, and in Japan's over there, and these tropical storms at this point will be curving just like they do off of East Florida, unless they come into the Caribbean, where the Coriolis effect turns them to the north, and they're going to come right into Japan perhaps here. All right, so that's just another natural hazard that Japan is subject to. Now, you can see tropical storm. We tend to say hurricanes over here if they reach a certain amount of intensity. They don't say hurricanes in the Western Pacific. They tend to use the word typhoon. And so you can see that Japan is on a typhoon track. Always keep in mind, only about 10% of the Earth's hurricanes/typhoons occur in the Atlantic, all right, and impacting the United States perhaps. The vast majority here are in the Western Pacific, which is entirely understandable since the Pacific's a much larger ocean, able to generate much stronger hurricanes. Okay, so you have a number of natural hazards that you know Japan is subject to, all right? Typhoons/hurricanes, tsunamis, landslides, volcanoes, and earthquakes. Good to know. Now, I'll contextualize the political relationships and thus much of the internal and external characteristics of Japan with respect to another key facet of Japanese physical geography, and that is that Japan is remarkably resource poor. This is an excerpt taken from the World Fact Book. In fact, I believe it's the CIA's World Fact Book. And it catalogs natural resources of countries, and you can see Japan marked off in red over here. I marked it off in red, and it shows that Japan has a remarkably poor endowment of natural resources. Quite frankly, it has pretty close to none, not industrially valued natural resources. Essentially none. What does it say there? Negligible mineral resources and fish. So Japan is remarkably resource poor in terms of natural resources of industrial value. Now hold this fact in mind as I discuss the critical Tokugawa shogunates of Japan, all right? Because I need to contextualize almost all of, well, as you will see, almost all of Japanese international behavior up to today has been contextualized by this fact of having very little natural resources. I'll give you examples here momentarily.